What are they booing about? I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks. We have a really special guest today, who is a friend and colleague of ours for several years now, Stanley, who teaches in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University. So welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks, David. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're happy to have you.
We've been wanting to get you on here for quite a while, and finally our schedules worked out, so we're really happy as well. So, and as we usually start out these interviews, we'd like to, have our listeners get a feel of who you are. And so you teach at Cardiff, and you call yourself a critical psychologist. So I want to lead with that question because a lot of people may not be familiar with that designation. And so can you say a little bit about that, what you mean by being a critical psychologist?
Yeah, sure. So I understand critical psychology as being a particular tradition that emerged partly in Europe, but also in the United States, and really anywhere where psychology has developed, which is both inside psychology, but also against psychology at the same time. There's different ways of understanding critical psychology. I quite like the idea that critical psychology is often critical of the kind of mainstream forms of psychology that we find dominant now, which is particularly cognitive psychology. But critical psychology and critical psychologists are not only inwardly looking at the discipline of psychology, they're also looking outwardly at the society itself and seeing how psychology and subjectivity can be understood and analyzed, particularly with a historical perspective and a cultural and a social perspective on psychology itself as a set of practices and institutions. So that's a kind of like academic definition, I guess, of critical psychology. I mean, in terms of my own background, I did an undergraduate degree in psychology in the 1990s in England, in Nottingham, at Nottingham Trent University, and then I went on to do a PhD in social psychology. But my work really, I really was disillusioned with psychology quite quickly after starting to study it. I thought psychology was supposed to be about helping people and about helping us to understand people, but I just felt marginalized, and I didn't feel my own life and my own background was really recognized in the psychology that I was learning. And it seemed like psychologists were in the business of categorizing people into whether they're normal or abnormal and putting people into boxes and doing statistics. And now, ironically, I still do some of that now, but I was really put off psychology. But then I came across all this critical stuff like feminist psychology and Marxist psychology and the anti-psychiatry movement. Mm-hmm. I got really, really into R.D. Laing and Michel Foucault and feminist researchers. And I think it's really that work that kept me interested in psychology.
Yeah, in fact, you turned us on to the work of, I remember, David Smale, right? What was his key book was Power, Interest, and I can't remember exact title, but
yes,
I remember
Power, Interest, in Psychology.
Yeah, you turned us on to that. And
it was
somebody who he worked in the NHS. Is that correct? Right?
That's right. Yeah. So David Smale, I was really influenced by his work as an undergraduate, and he was actually working in Nottingham, and I met him. He died a few years ago now, but he was working in the NHS in Nottingham. So the National Health Service, for those of us listening from other places around the world. And he was working in the NHS during the 1980s, which is when I grew up, really. So during really when the Thatcher reforms are really hitting the ground. And he writes so powerfully, but also very poignantly, actually. Again, in and against clinical psychology. I mean, he was a clinical psychologist, right? But he was deeply critical of clinical psychology at the same time. And if people are interested in his work, I really would recommend the book. It's called Taking Care, which was a popular book that he wrote, I think in the 1980s. And it's very powerful. There's a lovely video of him on YouTube as well, talking about depression. So if anyone searches David Smale and depression, they'll see him talking about depression in 1980s Britain.
There was quite a lot of it under the Thatcher years, I would think.
Yeah,
indeed.
And so, Stephen, you grew up in Liverpool, and I'm wondering, during your formative years, just how it's shaped your outlook and how it's influenced your perspective on what you do now.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. I grew up just opposite Liverpool on the Wirral, which is in the northwest of England. So it's where the ferry goes across the Mersey. That's if you get the ferry from Liverpool and you go, that's where you go. You go to the Wirral, and the Wirral was thought to be like the posh bit of Merseyside, and yet it had one of the largest council estates in Britain. So I grew up on the Woodchurch estate, which is a very large council housing estate, government housing. And I grew up in a single parent family. My mum brought me up on her own, and the 1980s on that council estate were really, really difficult. So really bad drug problems, particularly with heroin. And my mum protected me from that. And I managed to get to university through the influence of my mum and also my grandfather, who was like an organic intellectual, autodidact. I don't know if you've heard the book, The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists.
Yes, it's a classic.
It's a classic in like labor workers history, and it's about a painter and decorator who is very interested in politics, and he keeps trying to talk about politics with his mates on the job, and they don't want to hear about it. And really, my grandfather was like the main character in The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, and he was an intellectual, and he influenced me, and along with my mum, encouraged me to go to university. And I was the first person from my family to go to university. Just before the new Labour government started to introduce tuition fees in England in 1998. So I got in just before they started to put fees onto undergraduate degrees. And I think, that's influenced my background. I think coming from a context like that, I think it's very important that we understand the context in which people are living.
Yes.
That's what I think I've taken from that.
Yeah. And so how did you go from coming out with your PhD to getting interested in Buddhism and mindfulness and studying some of the early Pāli literature? I'm wondering how that transition happened for you.
Yeah. I mean, someone from my background, that there is nothing that would have predicted that I would go on to study, say, the Pāli canon.
Yeah.
there's nothing in there, because this is, the domain of, elite, Victorian scholars of the 19th century. So, yeah. I mean, I was lucky because I got a grant to do my undergraduate degree, and I also got a grant to do my PhD. So the ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council, funded my PhD. And it was on doing a PhD. So it was a critical, reflexive study of higher education and the experiences of psychology and social science PhD students. And I went to Loughborough, which is where I did my PhD thesis, to study discourse analysis, because I mentioned critical psychology, and that was one of the perspectives I was really interested in critical psychology. And I'd read a book by my PhD supervisor, Michael Billig, who is one of the students of Henri Tajfel, who is a European social psychologist working in post-World War II. And Michael Billig wrote a book called Talking of the Royal Family. And it's a study of how ordinary English families talk about royalty. And it's a popular book, and it's really critical of royalty and the monarchy, but in a really such an inspiring way, where he really takes seriously the voices of ordinary people, and people talking about royalty around their in their family dinner tables and in their living rooms. And I thought, what is this kind of work? I could really understand it, which was different to most academic journal articles I'd read, which I couldn't understand really very well.
We still have some trouble.
Yeah, I still do. I still struggle to understand them, because most of them are written so badly, because the academics are under so much pressure to publish that we hardly have any time to write well. And so I did my PhD largely to study that approach of discourse analysis with Michael Billig. And I was really fortunate in that I had a really good experience in my PhD. And I know this isn't at all the norm necessarily. And it was very reflexive. At the time when I was doing my PhD, I started to do Qigong. So this Chinese movement, like Tai Chi or something like that. But I was doing it in a personal capacity, largely because I was getting headaches really badly from all the thinking I was doing. And I was going to conferences, academic conferences, and I found them awful. I just couldn't handle it.
I'm with you on that one.
That'll give you headaches for sure. Yeah.
I think it was one of the first, and maybe one of the last conferences I went to was a British Psychological Society conference, and it was the centenary conference, so it was 100 years or something of psychology. And I went to this massive conference, and I found it really difficult. Because of the way in which it was being run. And I really struggled, actually. And that's partly what got me interested in Qigong and moving meditation. And also at that conference, I remember going down into the basement, and I think they were having a meeting of the Transpersonal Psychology Society.
Oh, that's why they put him in the basement, yeah.
Yeah, and they were doing something very strange that felt like a seance or something like that. And I was fascinated by this, and I don't really think I understood it at the time. I was very young, just in my early 20s, didn't really understand it. And I think that, combined with the Qigong, I just carried it on in a personal capacity for quite a number of years. I was a real zealot for Qigong for about 7 years. I mean, I practiced religiously, and I thought if people weren't doing Qigong, they were doing something wrong. And I did that for 7 years.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that about
yeah. But I kept the academic work very separate to that. And then about 2007 or so, 2006 or 7, someone wondered if I'd heard of Buddhism, and I hadn't, because of how I grew up. I mean, there's no context for me learning about Buddhism. You grow up on a council estate. That's not what you're supposed to learn about, but because I went to university and then, did a PhD and got a job as a lecturer, I was made available this other form of knowledge. And someone asked me if I'd heard about Buddhism, and I hadn't really. And they gave me a book by Stephen Batchelor called Buddhism Without Beliefs.
Oh, yes, I read that a while back, yeah.
Yeah, and that was a big influence. And I went on a retreat for the first time, I think it was 2007. And I thought, what on earth is this? I was very powerfully influenced. I just went straight into the deep end. I went on like a 10-day silent Vipassana retreat at a meditation center down in Devon called Gaia House. And I thought, this is really peculiar stuff. I mean, it felt a bit like a social psychology experiment, where you do something very strange with a bunch of people and you're told what to do. And then you do all these practices, and then whatever you do then is then treated as this universal thing that everyone can benefit from. And I think that was the first time I really started to take this stuff seriously. And also I remember at the time hearing the word mindfulness, and I thought, well, this is interesting, and there's more potential for me to do something on a word which is an English word than Qigong, which just sounds so obscure and unusual and strange. And I just thought there's something very interesting going on here. And I think that's really when I started to get interested in this stuff. And I had a study leave period in 2009. And that's when I really started to write about the stuff that I've been reading for about 2 years. I went on a massive reading spree to find out what all this stuff was. And then I was attending a lot of retreats, sometimes 1, 2, or 3 a year. And I started to shift my professional work onto mindfulness.
Yeah, in fact, I don't know if we had made contact or not, but I remember coming across that article you wrote in 2013, Things Said or Done Long Ago are Recalled and Remembered, The Ethics of Mindfulness in Early Buddhism, Psychotherapy and Clinical Psychology. I remember coming across that, and I wasn't sure, my memory doesn't serve me well. I don't know if we had met on email before that, but it's certainly soon after that we did.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I think you emailed me because we were both writing about military mindfulness.
Oh, yeah.
And I think you contacted me because I'd written this article, the one you mentioned, and it was a little bit about Elizabeth Stanley's work with mindfulness-based mind fitness training. And that was... there's different strands to my work, but that strand is about kind of looking into history to figure out how have we gotten to a place where you can have something called military mindfulness. How is that possible? And looking into the history of psychology and history of Buddhism to figure that out. But that was a few years after I'd started to think about these things, and I was kind of trying to write from different angles. So, like at first, I was really convinced that psychologists and social scientists needed to get into meditation and into Buddhism. And I was convinced that there was something interesting happening there that could address some of the problems, especially of psychology, which is so focused on kind of treating the mind as though it's this external object that kind of other people have And we can kind of look to other people, when I thought it had a very powerful potential for changing the practices of psychologists. Now, of course, now I realize this is quite an old idea, and I wasn't coming up with anything new at all. But and the other side of it was that I thought that the people who were practicing mindfulness and Buddhism could learn from the social sciences and could learn from the humanities. So it could go both ways, the learning, and that's what I started out trying to do. And I mean, that publication on the ethics and mindfulness and so on, I was invited to go to London to speak at this psychotherapy conference, and they were wanting to be mindful about mindfulness. And they invited me and a bunch of other people. What I didn't realize was that it was largely a group of psychoanalysts who were in a debate with humanistic and existential psychotherapists about who really owned mindfulness. Yeah. And of course, the psychoanalysts all want to say, well, it was Freud really, or Freud's followers that had really come up with this. And then the existentialists and the humanists were saying, well, no, it was Carl Rogers. And I didn't realize, but I should have known really, but I've been kind of thrust into this debate, between the psychotherapists about who owns mindfulness and what its history is, Did they actually use the word own, or are you just recalling that as a metaphor? That's my term. Yeah, I use that as a shorthand, really. Right. Sure. That's what I thought. Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if they used it, but yeah, that's. Yeah, that's my term. It's perhaps unfair, and I sometimes, say these things that are like my shorthand way of describing something. But I think. Yeah, what they were disputing was, where does it go back to, and they were saying, well, we've been doing it all along. And both of them were in, tension with the cognitive behavioral therapists, because it's the CBT therapy that has really been the dominating force in publicizing and mainstreaming mindfulness, particularly in Britain. Yeah, MBCT. Yeah, here too. Right. Yes, that's right. Yeah. And Stephen, since you are teaching in Wales at Cardiff, you have a special interest in T.W. Rhys-Davids. Did you want to say a bit about how you got engaged in looking historically at his work? And I know you've written a lot about it. And yeah. So I think it's a little bit unfashionable now to be a fan of Rhys-Davids, but I'm a fan of his. So Thomas William Rhys-Davids, so he's living in the 19th century. His father is Welsh. He was born in Swansea, and his father was a Welsh Congregationalist minister. And they moved to Essex, and his father was nicknamed the Bishop of Essex. Now, Rhys-Davids was a British civil servant, actually, and he was working in what was then Ceylon, so British-occupied, what's now Sri Lanka. And he was employed as a civil servant to kind of adjudicate on legal matters that were coming up in the country. And apparently the story goes is that he was adjudicating a case that was in Pāli, which is this language that the Buddha's teachings are arguably documented in. And so he had to figure out how to understand this Pāli. And he got friendly with a monk called, I can't pronounce their name, but it's something like Yatramul Unanens. And he became really friendly with this Sri Lankan monk who taught him Pāli. And Rhys Davids became a real convert, actually. That would be the right word to use, to Buddhism. And he was fascinated with it. And he didn't, conform to the, traditional idea of the colonial power who goes in and says, well, you're not Christian, therefore, we need to replace your religion with Christianity, which was probably what his, job title involved. But instead, he got really interested in Buddhism, and he and his wife, Caroline, they translated a lot of the Pāli canon of Buddhism into English, and they were the first to do this. Rhys Davids was at that time probably the world's foremost interpreter of Buddhism, and his books were read not only in Victorian England but also in Sri Lanka itself. So they read his books to find out what Buddhism was, which is interesting in itself. He was one of the first to date the Buddha, so to treat the Buddha as a historical figure, and he was one of the first to translate mindfulness from the Pāli Sati. And I don't know when I came across him. It could have been when I was reading all of this stuff back in, the early 2000s. But it was definitely when I was doing all my kind of Dharma training, and I did a course with Richard Gombrich at the Oxford Buddhist Centre, which was a Pāli language course. And I'm sure I would have come across Rhys Davids then, because Rhys Davids wrote one of the main dictionaries, which is still used now to translate between Pāli and English.
Didn't he struggle, and didn't he kind of have a bit of a struggle to figure out how he wanted to translate the term sati?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he did, and so did the bunch of scholars that were working with him at the time, because it wasn't just Rhys Davids, there's a whole bunch of them. Mm-hmm. And you can follow actually through his books, and it's really interesting actually, there's footnotes and so on that shows his veering between different types of terms. And I've written about this, so I can't remember the details, but if people follow my articles, they'll see what I was looking at. And there's different terms like conscience and memory and other forms of translation. Mindfulness isn't the only one at all. Of course, now that's the settled term, but of course these things, when you go back into history, there's a lot of debate. I mean, the phrase he uses to translate sati, which I really like, he calls it a wakefulness of heart. I
don't know if my memory serves me either, too, but I thought he came across some Anglican prayer to be mindful of your manners or something like that. I don't know exactly, but that triggered the idea that mindfulness, that might be it.
Absolutely, yes. And it's a very important point that all of the translators at this time were informed by their Christian contexts. And the bits that he was most influenced by, I think, was in the King James Bible, where they talk about, be mindful of the word of God.
Oh, yes, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and mindful, of course, it's important to remember that, mindfulness is the noun, and then mindful is an adjective. I mean, the adjective mindful, I think, goes back at least to the 14th century in terms of its use. We have to remember to be so-and-so, and also the idea that it's good to remember to be so-and-so, or it's good to remember the Lord. Whereas as a noun, mindfulness doesn't come in really until the 17th century, in the Enlightenment period, which, like Descartes and John Locke. And then it's only in the 19th century that mindfulness then gets treated as a translation of a Buddhist meditation practice, or as a psychological process that's happening with respect to Buddhism. I mean, before that point, mindfulness means something else. It doesn't mean what we think it means now.
Yeah, speaking of mindful, I'd like to turn our attention to some of the recent research you've been doing and how you've taken your skills in discourse analysis. You wrote a chapter for our handbook, Handbook of Mindfulness. The title is Constructing the Mindful Subject, Reformulating Experience Through Affective Discursive Practice in Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. Could you give us a little idea of what you were up to in that particular research and how you went about it, and what were some of the key takeaways that you observed from going through this research study?
Yeah. So I think initially, when I turned to mindfulness, I turned to it as an alternative to discourse analysis, actually, in the sense that, and we can come back to this later maybe, which is mindfulness as a kind of research method or like a research tool. Because there's this whole debate about, the extent to which when we're analyzing social life, we should be analyzing language practices and discourse practices in contrast to other forms of practices like embodied and affective practices. But I just say that as a kind of prelude. But so these studies, and there's a few of them now in this kind of part of my work, which is wanting to actually look at what mindfulness teachers do when they're teaching a course in mindfulness. It's really surprising when you look out there's thousands of studies now, on mindfulness.
Yeah.
Mainly in psychology and neuroscience and clinical psychology, but also now in the social sciences and humanities. It's difficult to keep up, really. But what's really fascinating is how few of them actually look at what's going on within courses in mindfulness.
Right, absolutely.
It's really, really strange that you've got this almost massive lacuna, actually, given how much is kind of predicated on mindfulness now. It's surprising that there's that gap.
Well, when you have the positivist approach, then that gap is going to be huge. I mean,
that's right. Yeah. Because if you just took like psychometrics, like self-report scales, or you look at the randomized control trials, or experiments in cognitive psychology, none of them really look at what's going on in a course in mindfulness. And then if you look at, the qualitative research, there's a lot of textual analysis and there's a lot of interviews, but very few people actually go and look at what's happening in the courses. So
when you say in the courses, does that, by way of that, also mean that people aren't really looking at the experience or the processes or the experiential part of what's occurring? It's almost like it's a black box. It's just this behaviorist or linguistic term, and we're missing that internal part of it.
Partly it's that. I think when I talk about within the courses, I think I mean
the interactions.
What is going on in the
between the teachers and the
teaching process.
And I'm thinking especially about 8-week courses. So the kind of standard model that turns out actually isn't really the standard. And we can go on to talk about that later in respect to our mapping project. But the 8-week course is, what's going on interactionally. So
social psychology. Yeah.
What's said? Yeah, kind of what's said and what's done and what's being taught and what's the language and what's even, I don't like this term, but what's the body language? What's happening, and that does include people's experiences.
Sure.
but studying the course itself rather than relying on people's like post hoc accounts of their experience, which there is a lot of research on that, but there's very little of what's actually going on.
Yes, and you're one of the pioneers of doing that. That's what your research was about.
Well, and the title has an evocative signaling, I think, constructing the mindful subject. I think there's a lot in just that, those four words.
Yeah. So I did this project in collaboration with Rebecca Crane, who's the director of the Centre for Mindfulness Research and Practice in Bangor, in North Wales. And she is very interested in what the teachers bring to the courses to create the conditions for people to learn mindfulness. So she calls it like teacher competency. And she actually approached me and wanted to learn some skills of discourse analysis and conversation analysis to try to look at what is going on in the courses. And so we really were focused on what the teachers were doing more than what the students are doing. And I think that's quite unique and distinctive as well, because most research is not on what the teachers are doing. Most research is what the efficacy is, or effectiveness.
Or the outcome.
Yeah, efficacy, outcomes.
Yeah, that's right. So we basically spent a long time, and actually I think there's 3 papers on this actually, or papers or chapters, and one is the one you're talking about, Ron, which is the constructing the mindful subject. There's another one called Disciplined Improvisation, which is also on this subject. And then there's one that's going to come out this year, which was written with my colleague Ilmari Kortelainen from Finland. And that's going to be in a book called Assembling Therapeutics. And we basically spend a long time analyzing largely audio, but sometimes video and audio records of 8-week courses and mindfulness training events. And we spend a long time bringing the skills of discourse and conversation analysis to looking at those materials. It's very time intensive. It's not quick.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But yeah, it's really time intensive, but you can learn an enormous amount from doing that.
And so what was some of your key surprises or insights or observations that you thought were significant?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things is that we've been mostly focused on what mindfulness teachers call inquiry. So inquiry or dialogue. So this is when, usually after they've taught a meditation practice, they will engage in a piece of interaction between participants where they ask what their experience was. So they will ask things like, so what did you notice about your meditation practice? Now, this is quite interesting historically because it's actually relatively unusual in Buddhist retreat settings for teachers to ask these kinds of questions. It does happen in Goenka Vipassana courses, but not in quite the same way as in these so-called secular mindfulness courses. And so what happens, we've shown, is that it's very easy to assume that mindfulness courses are kind of characterized by a kind of openness and a kind of liberal egalitarianism, you could say. And you would expect that because of the way in which the participants are often sat in mindfulness courses in a circle. I like to think of this as a kind of circle democracy, the idea that everyone has an equal say, and that you're kind of free to say whatever you please, and that there's that kind of open liberalness. Mm-hmm. But what we found actually is that mindfulness courses generally, and this is based on what we've done so far, so it might change, over time, but are highly regulated and controlled and structured down to kind of exquisite levels of detail. Now, that's not unique to mindfulness courses. This happens in all forms of what conversation analysts call institutional interaction, like between doctors and patients, or in a classroom between teachers and students. So this is quite common, but mindfulness teachers may not realize the degree to which the teacher controls, often in quite subtle, kind of liberal ways, the direction and focus of the interaction. And there's a lot I could talk about on this, but I don't want to go kind of too much into detail. But one of the ways in which this is shown is through the way in which the mindfulness teacher subtly reformulates what people are saying in order for them to illustrate the aims of the course. That's quite a subtle practice, and I'm not sure how many teachers are aware of this as they're doing it. I think some of the awareness of these processes of power and social control require discourse analysis and conversation analysis that you can't do in the moment, but you need a lot of time in your research to look at,
and not just time, but a kind of consciousness, the ability to step outside of and reflect structurally, or from a social science point of view, what's happening in terms of, as you say, power relationships. There's some work done with Rogerian therapy where the Rogerian therapist is kind of steering the client in a certain way, and even in critical pedagogy, people have stepped outside and said, well, are you really letting the students come to their own conclusions, or are you kind of guiding them? I suppose you could argue it goes all the way back to Socrates, who would have done that too. But the point is, it's important to step back and look at the power relations, not just from within, but from a little bit from outside, to look at the unspoken or implicit norms that are happening.
Indeed, yeah, I think that's really important. And I think the other important point to notice is that, we're not saying here that power is only necessarily oppressive.
Right.
And we were very influenced by Michel Foucault in that article. And, he argued that, power dynamics and power relations can be productive of knowledge, yes, including self-knowledge. And so that links in with the title that Ron said, the mindful subject is someone who is subjected through their will, to the discourses and normative patterns of mindfulness meditation training. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad or wrong. Mm-hmm. It means that we're more exposing the forms of knowledge and the forms of normativity that are being kind of prescribed in often quite a subtle and very encouraging way in these practices. One of the characteristic forms of the discourse of the mindfulness teacher is that they'll say, encouraging you now to focus on your breathing, which is a kind of indirect, passive instruction. It's not a command. No. It's not like, sit down, pay attention.
Like invite you to.
Yeah, invite. Yeah,
inviting. That's very common in the school-based programs, I've noticed, which one of my PhD students, Ellie Halewood, is doing an ethnography of mindfulness in schools. And one of the things the teacher will say is they'll get up in front of the class and they'll say, inviting you to take a fothbok, which is feet on floor, bum on chair. And it's very interesting because it's a kind of indirect, passive instruction, but also because the agency is missing from that. They're not saying like, I want you now to do this.
Right.
Instead, we're encouraging you. And it's not to suggest, just to be really clear, I'm not contesting the intentions of the teachers here. Yeah. I'm not suggesting they're being manipulative at all, actually. And this is a really important point. Instead, what we're looking at is how the language is working and how the interaction is working. And power is not so straightforwardly, the product of an individual agent. And so I'm not doubting that the intentions of the teachers are good, or even that the outcomes might be good. But until we actually start to study this stuff, we don't have much of a ground to go anywhere, I think.
One of the things maybe before we move on is that you did bring up Foucault and how that influenced your work in this particular study. And Foucault basically was also studying the confessional, the role of confession in clergy at the time of when the institutions of the church were in full glory. I'm wondering, do you see any parallels there? Is the confessional operating in these classes in some other way, or maybe some aspect of that? In the church, you go to confession, you confess your sins to the priest. And, I don't know if mind wandering is a kind of a modern equivalent of Christian sin, but I'm wondering if you see anything like that going on.
Yeah, so I did mention before, how it's relatively unusual in like a silent Buddhist meditation retreat for people to be asked, okay, what did you notice in your meditation? Mm-hmm. And then for that to become a kind of public dialogue between the teacher and the participants, but also between the participants themselves in a group kind of en masse way. That's quite unusual. So I started to think, well, maybe that inquiry, maybe that dialogue is actually not from Buddhism. Perhaps, and instead it has different historical roots. And I think that the roots are at least two of them, and I think we've mentioned two already. One is Carl Rogers. Mm-hmm. He's the first psychotherapist to broadcast his therapy on television. He is an innovator in that way. In the 1950s and 60s, you got therapy, one-on-one therapy, his classic Gloria mm-hmm. therapy, and he's got group therapy being broadcast on television. And I think this is a key influence of the mindfulness courses, where you're asked to talk about your experience and to be authentic in your communication. And I think the other influence is a religious one, I think. And I need to do a bit more work on this, because we always need to be a bit careful when we're making claims of historical influence. But I do think that the other influence is, rather than Buddhism, it's more likely to be Christian fellowship meetings. So very large-scale group mass confessions happening in the mid-20th century. I've been looking at ones happening in Britain especially, where you have large groups of people, in this case mostly women, confessing their sins, whether that's that they're alcoholics or whether that's that they have sexual fantasies, and they're doing those confessions en masse in public. And I think the mindfulness inquiry and the dialogues are perhaps influenced by those mass confessionals. And I do think it's quite interesting. I do think, the idea that now a kind of contemporary sin, although I don't think mindfulness teachers would agree with this, but
no, probably not.
It wouldn't be as strong as that, but it is that your mind wanders. This is what we need to confess.
Ron has written about that. Ron. Right.
That's right.
Well, you've been doing some very innovative work too in your classes, and I know David is much more knowledgeable than I am. But what you're calling these breaching experiments, and connecting that to a term you're using, social mindfulness. Is that? Do you want to say a little bit about these experiments and?
Yeah. So, some of my work has been this historical investigation of Buddhism and psychology and mindfulness. And then some of my work is like studying what's happening in mindfulness courses, mainly in the mainstream, the most kind of mainstream courses we can find. And then another side of my work is based on all of that previous work, the two different threads. What might we do differently to how things are currently done? And I've been kind of experimenting, I think that's the right word, with revisioning mindfulness and meditation practices in ways that are different to the styles and forms of practices that I've been analyzing in all my reading and then analyzing the courses. So we, and I say we, this is like my students and myself and colleagues have been experimenting with, mindfulness as a kind of social research tool. So a bit like earlier on, I said, well, psychologists could get into meditation or sociologists could get into meditation. Well, what would it look like if we actually turn the practices of meditation and mindfulness into more like socially relevant and socially contingent experiments? And so I was really struck by the similarity between a meditation retreat and a social psychology experiment. And I started to read Harold Garfinkel, who is a sociologist working in the 60s, and he developed something called ethnomethodology, which is like the study of everyday people's or what he calls members' ways of making sense and members' ways of doing things and making reality seem normal and all of that. And so I came across a kind of amazing book by this guy called Bernie McGrain. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. But,
no, haven't. No.
So it's called the Un-TV and the 20-mile-an-hour car. And it's a really weird book.
It sounds weird, the titles.
Yeah. I think McGrain was a student of Garfinkel because he's got like a recommendation or something by Garfinkel and some of his students. And he had this idea of his students going into a shopping mall, and he's in the United States, and being what he called unoccupied and unemployed for 10 minutes. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. Bernie McGrain called it Zen sociology.
Really?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And he got all his students to do this. They're a little bit like the Garfinkel experiments. He called them breaching experiments from the 60s. And he asked his students, for example, well, probably told them actually, to, for example, you get to a checkout and you're in a shop, and it's you get to the checkout and you may have a standard priced item, maybe it's like $1.99 or something, but instead of paying that, you barter with the checkout assistant. And you say, you want $1.99 for this? I'll give you $1.50.
So in other words, you're breaking the unspoken rule, the norm.
Yeah, that's right. You're doing something that's counter-normative, but you're not just doing it for the sake of it. It's funny to do it, but you're not just doing it in the sake of it. You're doing it to learn something about what rules are exposed.
Right, or implicitly there. Yeah,
that's right. And
exposes them.
Yeah, and one of the things that happened in the checkout experiment is that the cashier would say, "You're mad."
Right, that's right. Madness is the violation of the norms. Yeah. Yeah,
and so the rule that's exposed is something like, well, everyone assumes each other is mentally sane.
It allows us to have just stable expectations about that people are going to follow the norms.
Yeah, and you also see what happens when you break a norm in society. Someone can say, hey, you're mad. You're insane. So you can see how it linked with my interest in anti-psychiatry and all of that, and R.D. Laing, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. And Bernie McGrain's students did the standing still thing in the mall, and the security guards approached them and were like, you cannot loiter. You can't loiter in the mall. And it exposed all of these taken for granted assumptions about what you're supposed to do. So I took my students out. We've been doing this for about 5-6 years now. Every year we do something called a standing still demonstration, where we go to a public space in Cardiff in the city centre, and a bunch of us, and that can vary from 10 people to 200 people, we just go and stand still for 10 minutes.
Are they meditating at that moment?
So I give a little bit of instruction in very simple mindfulness. And all I mean by that is just pay attention to what's happening at your senses. That's pretty much all I tell them, because I'm partly trying to teach them how to observe, so to be observant, like ethnographers, and notice what happens. And of course, they're social science students, so they observe in a social science way, and it's kind of fascinating. They're really simple exercises, and they're really cheap and easy to do, and students really mostly find them fun, and you can discover really interesting things through them.
Did you write this up? Have you written about this?
Yeah, so we've got like 2 or 3 papers. One is called Swimming Against the Stream, and it's in the Qualitative Research in Psychology journal, and we write about the experience of standing still in the city centre, in the high street. So there's 2 or 3 papers, and we're writing another one this year that's looking at the video analysis. And so, we're really interested not only in how people respond to the standing still, but we're also really interested in what it's like for the people standing still.
Yeah.
In these largely consumer spaces,
Well, 2 questions. Do you see it as a kind of a social mindfulness experiment in that it could further other consumers out there in terms of their awareness of what some of the norms are in society? And then you also mentioned at one point to us that is this part of what you had done with when your university was on strike and there were some kind of demonstrations? Is there some similarity there?
Yeah. I think that part of the aim of the experiment is just to see what happens. So it's genuinely open-minded. I mean, we don't have a hypothesis. We're not going in with a preconceived idea, and every time it's different. We see patterns of things that tend to happen. And one of the most fascinating aspects is when sometimes, some years people kind of join in. They come and stand in the high street. Maybe they're supposed to be just walking along, shopping on their phone. And sometimes people just come and join in, even if it's just for a few moments. And
do they think it's a flash mob or something?
I think sometimes people are waiting, expecting that we're going to start dancing or something like that. And also some people think it's like a political protest. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing you mentioned is with the was really much more a political protest. So I'm really fascinated by new forms of political demonstration and new forms of activism. And one of the interesting things you see now is the use of silence in demonstrations and in activism. Yeah. So, you see this with the, the shootings that you had in the States, the school shootings, and you had this amazing protest, a female school student, I think, who was giving a talk, but left a very long space and of silence. And this is very interesting, very, very powerful. And I think also during Occupy Wall Street and other Occupy movements, you have this quite interesting adaptation of meditation practices for political campaigning and organizing and making a point, in quite a powerful way. So I was influenced by some of this stuff. And last year, university staff in the Russell Group, so this is the elite universities in the UK, they went on strike in defense of their pensions. So staff were having their pensions cut, and we staged a very long strike. It was 2 weeks, and that's the longest strike I think I've certainly ever known in 15 years of being a lecturer. And it was a massive thing. And, of course, you've got like the usual things, you've got demos, and you've got like marches, and you've got picket lines and so on. And you've got, as well as that, music and creative stuff. And I thought, well, I could bring this breaching experiment to the strike and kind of bring people together in a new way, and also in a way kind of breach the strike at the same time by bringing the silence into it, because most of the time we're just being really loud and noisy and kind of irritating people. And I thought, well, let's bring meditation into that and see what happens. And we stood still for, again, 10 minutes in front of the Students' Union building, protesting about their silence around the issues. And also, I led like a very large, I felt a bit like Thich Nhat Hanh, leading walking meditation around the main building where our Vice Chancellor works. And that felt like a bit like a funeral march, like we were kind of grieving, higher education or something like that. And these were quite powerful events, and people told me afterwards that they were able to kind of explore the issues with each other in different ways, and bringing their emotions and kind of thoughts into the demonstration in a different way. And we've continued doing this kind of thing at Cardiff, like meditation demonstrations, which are a bit more politically engaged.
That is so cool.
That's great.
Well, I think we really need to talk about this massive research project that you are been involved in for a few years now, from the Leverhulme Trust. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, Leverhulme Trust.
Leverhulme Trust, and you received like 214,000 British pounds for this particular research. Do you want to give us a little snapshot of what this project is all about?
Yeah, so sure. Yeah, shifting gear a little bit, I think. This is a 3-year project. We started it in 2017. And it's really in that kind of part of my work that I described earlier, which is studying what is going on with respect to the mindfulness movement, so-called, in the UK. We have a team of researchers who are working on this. So it's myself, Alp Arat, who is a sociologist of religion, Peter Hemming, who's an education sociologist, and Richard King, who's a Buddhist Studies professor. And he authored the book with Jeremy Corrett, Selling Spirituality. And it's basically an attempt to document and provide evidence with respect to the mindfulness movement today as a social phenomena. So it's probably the first study, I think, in the UK and maybe globally to have a systematic social science with a humanities scholarship angle on the key questions with respect to mindfulness now. It's called mapping mindfulness. This is like our short kind of term for the project, because we are mapping mainly the mindfulness teaching community. It's really a study of the mindfulness teachers, and and the trainers, the supervisors, the coaches, the therapists, and so on, the people who are responsible for disseminating mindfulness into the population. And we're mapping partly geographically, so where the teachers are, but also socially in terms of demographics, who are the teachers who teach mindfulness. And we're also looking at what they're studying and what they're teaching and where they're teaching it across a diverse set of contexts. So across health, education, work, politics, and religion. And we have three main methodological strategies. One is a online survey, which is still open at the moment, and we're encouraging mindfulness teachers who are based in the UK and teaching in the UK to participate in it. The other methodological strategy is interviewing. So we'll be doing almost 100 interviews with mindfulness teachers. And then the third is a case study ethnographies. So we're doing field work this year in mindfulness events across those domains that I mentioned. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and so you've been attending a lot of these events all over the UK and Wales, like what's been going on in Westminster and the UK Mindfulness Initiative. Do you want to say a little bit about some of the events you've attended and what you've been noticing here and there? I mean, I know it's a broad question.
Yeah. So I think our first strategy actually has been to attend all the big events that are happening that are addressing publics and also professional groups en masse. So it's very social psychology, this part. We're kind of interested in the kind of large scale public dissemination of mindfulness in these events. So it's very interesting what's happening in the UK at the moment. Some people say, well, it's like the kind of vanguard of the mindfulness movement because of partly of how much is going on, the sheer amount of activity, given that it's quite a small country, really, but also because of the degree to which it's been institutionalized, mindfulness, through university research centers.
And the NHS.
And also the NHS and the Westminster and also the devolved governments, the Welsh government and Scottish government and the Irish Parliament as well. And so this is quite fascinating, really, to think about these kind of social questions of, what does it mean that this nation or this collection of nations is being kind of turned into like a mindful nation, which is the aim of the Mindfulness Initiative, which, if people don't know, in 2015, this was a report which people can find online if they want to read about it, which came out of a series of consultations in Westminster across social sectors, which really aims to implement mindfulness across the public sector and lobby for funding. And the Mindfulness Initiative really is like a lobbying group. And so we've kind of been dipping into these different sectors. The project itself that we're doing really is mapping on quite a broad scale. We're never going to be able to go into the detail on all of these. And I should say that my colleague, Joanna Cook, has been studying the Westminster Mindfulness Initiative for many years and doing a very long-term ethnography. And I think she has a book coming out very soon that's much more focused on the Mindfulness Initiative. But the ones we've been attending included the Mindfulness Initiative. We've been to several of their events, one which was on education. You would have been interested in it, David, because Goldie Hawn was there. And I know how much you like Goldie Hawn.
I actually do like her. I just don't necessarily agree with her approach. But.
Mind up, yeah.
Indeed, yeah. And also we went to one that was about mindfulness in the armed forces and in the emergency services, where we heard about military mindfulness at Westminster, which was absolutely fascinating. We heard about the Jedi warrior training that's being imported from the US to the UK to train soldiers in their pre-deployment in mindfulness. And the other thing we went to, which is really fascinating, as well as some of the university events, is something called the Mindful Living Show. So this is like an exhibition. Apparently Britain is really like an innovator in the whole genre of the exhibition. It's a very Victorian thing,
Yeah.
which is like people have stalls and you go around, perusing their mindful wares, it's a trade show essentially for mindfulness. And this is absolutely fascinating. And thousands of people are attending these events, the mindful living shows. And my favorite is what I picked up at one of the mindful living shows is something called Max Mind Power, which is a meditating bear. And you press Max's paw and he speaks a meditation instruction to you in like a male British accent. And it's really, really fascinating that mindfulness can be kind of embodied in this like material, like consumer object of a bear, like a cuddly teddy bear. And, I genuinely like Max Mind Power. I mean, I really like him. And
it seems to have gotten to you.
Yeah, I mean, he's for kids, and he has like a breathing mechanism, and it's for kids that can hold Max and to get meditation instructions, and it's just so fascinating. And it's kind of easy to make fun of this stuff, and the self-help particularly, it's so commodified, that it's easy to make fun of it and to dismiss it. But what we've been starting to think about is who attends mindfulness courses and why. And at the Mindful Living Show, it's probably like 80 to 90% women who are attending these courses. And actually on the Mindful Living Show, the social class demographic is quite diverse. You get people from all different class backgrounds, partly because it's relatively cheap to attend. And we went to another event up in Coventry called Mindfulness and Spiritual Intelligence. And that was in Coventry Cathedral on a Saturday night. And it was like £5 to attend. And there's like 500 people there. And mostly women, but also more ethnically and racially and religiously diverse than a lot of mindfulness events. Partly because it's cheap, but also because it's engaging with this broader like spiritual milieu, of like the New Age or like alternative religion, alternative spirituality. And so one of the things we're thinking about at the moment is the degree to which, the mindfulness movement as a whole might represent a kind of shift of the secular in a more religious and spiritual direction. But also the way in which the movement might well be a kind of new women's movement of some sort. And we're really in the midst of it at the moment, so I can't say much more because we're kind of still collecting data. And but the key point for me to get across is that I'm genuinely interested and open-minded with respect to what mindfulness is doing for people. I don't buy the kind of idea that it's just automatic neoliberalism. I think it really depends on the kind of contexts we look at and who is taking part and what they're doing with those practices in the context of their lives. And I think that once we start to do these empirical studies, we may find things that actually pose some even more difficult questions than the ones we've already been asking.
Well, that's interesting. We just interviewed Wako Shannon Hickey on her book, The Mind Cure, and her early history was talking a lot about how women were basically the pioneers for these movements, but they were much more community-oriented than individualistic oriented. But I think in the UK it's very different than what's happening here in the US, because if you want to attend Wisdom 2.0, it's going to cost you $1,500.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. I think that we need to look at the context, like I said at the start, and like, Jamie Kuczynska's, her book, The Mindful Elite, which I love, and I still need to talk to Jamie to congratulate her on that. But I think actually the story that we're finding in the UK is more of a story of precarity, actually, than it is a story of elites, because we have almost 500 people who have completed our survey so far, who are mindfulness teachers, and we really encourage more teachers to participate, because we're getting a really interesting picture of the movement. And one thing we're finding is what we would expect. Most teachers of mindfulness are female. They're white, they're middle class, middle-aged, highly educated. But, and this is quite an important but, is that they're largely teaching mindfulness in precarious conditions. They're working part-time, maybe in addition to a paid job, being poorly paid or unpaid for their mindfulness teaching. And so the picture we get is not so far the story of the kind of mindful elites, or like the idea that mindfulness is a neoliberal corporate thing, and that it's successful. It's actually a much more precarious. When you look at the field and the movement from almost like a work sociology perspective, you look at the working conditions, you find a much more precarious, feminized workforce. And I agree with you as well, Ron, on the issue of like the female founders, because there's a key female founder even in the US mindfulness movement that's consistently forgotten in the literature, and I don't know how many people know about her, but Peggy Roggenbuck Gillespie, who was one of the co-founders of the stress reduction clinic with John Kabat-Zinn. And she's pretty much edited out of the whole history. And Matthew Drage, who's a PhD student, well, he graduated recently at Cambridge. His work shows actually how Peggy Roggenbuck Gillespie's influence has been really neglected in the telling of the history of MBSR. And she wrote a book, I need to get hold of it. It's like a popular stress reduction book, I think back in the 80s. And I don't have it. And that's kind of bad news, because I'm a mindfulness geek, like you guys. I collect everything on mindfulness. And yet I didn't know about Peggy. And
yeah, that's telling.
I think it's
really important. Yeah,
I think it's different here in the U.S. I can't really say, I don't have the empirical backing for this, but I think most mindfulness teachers here in the U.S. are more male. That's just my sense.
I wonder whether it partly depends on the sector. In the workplace sector that we're looking at, it's more likely, and we need to test this because we haven't closed our survey yet, but I suspect that in the workplace field, more of the teachers will be male.
Well, that's interesting, because that may have some connection to the individualist strand versus the communal or community strand of.
Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, I'm just basing this on a recent interview we just did with Waco's new book called The Mind Cure. And in the early history of New Thought, the women who were leading those movements were much more interested in also participating in social activism, and saw it much more as a kind of community-based religious movement with social activist impulses. whereas the individualist strand was much more male-dominated.
Yeah, and they won out.
And they imported the scientific veneer, but it was all about prosperity and career success and that sort of thing.
Okay, again.
Yeah.
Apropos of that, can you just briefly talk about the social mindful toolbox? I don't know if you're calling it the toolbox anymore. That's online, and also the mindful social change network for people that might be interested in that.
Yes. So the social mindfulness toolbox, we did change the name to Being Mindful of Our World, a collection of social mindfulness voices. And that's partly because we realized it's not really a toolbox.
No.
It's more like a collection of interviews with almost a dozen or over a dozen scholars and practitioners from 6 different countries, I think, who are talking about mindfulness in a way that acknowledges social context. And attempting to practice mindfulness meditation differently and teach mindfulness meditation differently, that brings in social and cultural and historical difference into thinking. I kind of think about it as a little bit like post-therapeutic, in the sense that it's still engaged in the practice of therapeutics, but it's trying to understand the world in which we're living in a more embedded way when we're teaching mindfulness. And so, people can really learn a lot from these interviews, I think, and they're fascinating introductions. Even if you're just a beginner in meditation or mindfulness, you could watch these to get a bit of a sense of also the debates that are happening about mindfulness. And we got a bunch of really interesting people.
We'll put a link to that on our Mindful Cranks website.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah,
that would be great. And the other thing is the Mindfulness and Social Change Network. Now, this is organized by Paula Haddock and Luke Rayford. And we could put a link to the Mindfulness and Social Change Network too. That's a global network with, I think, over 100 people, maybe more, who are thinking about mindfulness with respect to social, economic, and environmental justice. And who are often also engaged in activism, although not always. Sometimes they're working in the public sector as well, or in research. And I really recommend it. It's a great network. And I think it was last year or the year before, we organized an event called Mindfulness on the Margins, which was about thinking about mindfulness from outside of the kind of positivist research and therapeutic effectiveness research that we mentioned before. And also there was an attempt in that event to run events that are a little bit more flat in their in terms of the hierarchy, so that everyone gets a chance to speak and to run a session, which are quite different to some of the other large conferences that run on mindfulness now. Yeah.
And you're planning a book, aren't you, with your colleagues? That's going to be a compilation of the work you've been doing with the research project?
Yes, that's right. So with the Mapping Mindfulness project, we will be writing a book. We'll be writing the proposal and getting a few chapters together this year. In fact, we're starting to write some of the first articles that are coming out from the project based on the theoretical background, which is involving quite a large literature review of all the social science and humanities research on mindfulness to date, and establishing mindfulness as a valid object of social investigation and cultural investigation. But also we're writing an article that's going to be on the religious, secular or post-secular aspects of mindfulness based on our survey. Your
colleague Alp Arrett, right, is been doing a lot of work in that area.
Yeah, that's right. So Alp's very interested in the sociology of religion, and he has a few articles which are worth reading actually now, if people are interested in the idea of mindfulness representing a kind of transformation of the secular in the direction of a more religious and more spiritual direction. And so I find Alp's work really helpful because it gets us out of this kind of what I see now as a little bit of a dead end where we decide how Buddhist is mindfulness. I think for me I've ran out of steam a bit on that.
Yeah.
And I think actually a lot of the influences, if we don't assume that perspective from the start, it opens us up to start looking at other influences on the movement, like new religious movements and the New Age and
metaphysical religions. Yeah,
absolutely. It really broadens and opens up the discussion, and it also allows us to talk about things that have been a bit difficult to talk about, like Christianity.
Yeah. Well, before we go, I wanted to ask you about your punk rock career.
Okay, that was a left field.
Yeah, it's a curveball. I had to throw it.
That's a curveball. Okay, so well, I was in. Okay, I'm gonna have to engage a different part of my brain now.
Or what you're doing now. I mean, you kind of got back into playing music recently.
Yeah, that's right. So I've been playing music for a long time, since I was 17. I was very closely associated with a let's say hardcore punk band in the 90s called Bob Tilton, which was an English punk band, a bit like Fugazi. And I was really a big fan of theirs, and they were friends of mine. And then we did a band after they split up called the Wolves of Greece. And that was a very intense hardcore band where you couldn't even guarantee you would get to the end of the first song before, the vocalist has gone into the drummer. All the instruments have just flown into the crowd. And then after then, I really calmed down a lot. It probably coincided with my Qigong and meditation practice. I was in a band called I Am Spartacus, which was like a post-rock instrumental band, which you can still find the album. It's called Forward. It's got a bear on the front. And we did that in 1998. And then I spent probably 20 years writing my own songs. And I have a Bandcamp page which has almost all of my own, my own songs.
Wow.
I play guitar and sing and write songs. And,
that's fantastic.
That's impressive. It's great.
And I just joined a band called the Puss Puss Band, which is a local band here in South Wales. And I'm playing rhythm guitar with them and having a lot of fun.
Well, that's great. Well, Stephen, I think we had a great interview. We covered so much ground. It was so much fun, and we learned a lot. I think our listeners are going to be really fascinated by following up the threads here. And again, we want to thank you for joining us on the Mindful Cranks.
Thanks so much, Stephen.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
Our guest today has been Dr. Stephen Stanley, who is a critical psychologist in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University, Wales. He is interested in the history and philosophy of psychology and its intersection with Buddhism, and is currently studying the therapeutic culture of late modernity with a particular focus on the mindfulness movement. Alongside his academic research, Stephen has a 20-year meditation practice and has undertaken the 2-year Committed Dharma Practitioner Programme at Gaia House in Devon and the Pāli Summer School at Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies at Oxford. He is leading co-editor of the Handbook of Ethical Foundations of Mindfulness and the Principal Investigator of a 3-year research project, Beyond Personal Well-Being, a landmark study which is mapping the mindfulness movement in the United Kingdom funded by the Leverhulme Trust. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Cranks. Check out our Twitter and Facebook pages, and give us a review on iTunes when you get a chance. You could check out some of our publications on mindfulcranks.com. We look forward to seeing you at the next episode. Our outro music today is Stephen Stanley himself, performing one of his original tunes, Noah's Ark. Check out some of his other music on our webpage, themindfulcranks.com.
Will keep us in line until the storm comes. And it will come to cover everything. It's torrential, we'll go up on the hill and we'll build a boat. We'll call it Noah's Ark, because we're animals and there are two of us. But boats will roll and sharks will eat you whole, like in the movies where everyone is invincible and no one dies. No one dies, except Brandon Lee, 'cause he died, didn't he? Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Da, da, da. You are my anchor. You are my power. You are my fire. You are my one true love. You are my anchor. You are my power. You are my fire. You are my one true love. And when we're out at sea, in waters cold as ice, we'll send a dove to